Every school in the world teaches the same story. Writing was invented in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Clay tablets, cuneiform marks, grain counts, temple records, the first king's name pressed into wet earth. Neat. Ordered. The beginning of civilization. It is a good story. And in 2025, researchers studying cave walls across Europe quietly prove that it is wrong. Not wrong by a decade. Not wrong by a century. Wrong by 35,000 years. Her name is Genevieve von Petzinger. She is a Canadian paleoanthropologist, and she has spent years doing something almost no one thought to do before her. She went into the caves, and she looked at the walls. Not at the animals, the horses, the bison, the handprints that every documentary shows you. She looked at what everyone else had been walking past for 100 years. The marks. Across 367 documented Paleolithic rock art sites, stretching from northern Spain to the Ural Mountains of Russia, carved and painted over a span of 30,000 years, there was a category of mark that had been classified and shelved as abstract geometric signs. Decoration, perhaps. Ritual symbols, maybe. Not worth the serious attention given to the figurative art. Von Petzinger gave them serious attention. She compiled a database. She identified gaps. She and her photographer husband spent the equivalent of 2 weeks underground, crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body, recording marks deep in caves where the ceiling was low enough to require army crawling, where the dark had not been broken in thousands of years. And then she counted. Across the entire continent of Europe, across 30,000 years of human occupation, across hundreds of sites separated by thousands of miles, she found exactly 32 distinct symbol types. Not thousands, not hundreds. 32. The same triangle, the same line, the same Y shape, the same set of dots, appearing again and again across geography and across time, with a consistency that could not be coincidence and could not be decoration. For there to be this much continuity between sites, she wrote, I realized that our ancient ancestors had to have a system in place. Here is why 32 is the number that breaks everything. You would expect, if these marks were purely decorative, if each person was simply scratching whatever came to mind, an enormous variety. Every individual leaving their own random marks across 30,000 years of human creativity, across hundreds of separate sites, would produce a chaotic mess of different forms. But that is not what happened. Nearly 3/4 of all the symbol types were already in use during the earliest period von Petzinger studied, a window called the Aurignacian, between 40,000 and 28,000 years ago. Not a few basic marks gradually developing into more complex ones over time. The full system, nearly all 32 types, was already in use from the beginning. This does not look like the startup phase of a brand new invention, she wrote. It looked like the continuation of something that already existed before these people arrived in Europe. Something they brought with them. Something shared. Something that functioned as a system, not a decoration, not a random impulse, but a visual vocabulary that people spread across a continent were using to mean the same things. Von Petzinger called it an early predecessor to writing. Not writing as we define it. Not words, not sentences, not a phonetic system. But something that functioned like writing functions, carrying meaning from one mind to another across space and time, on a surface that outlasted the person who made it. This is, by any reasonable definition, what writing is for. Now add this. In the summer of 2024, a research team led by archaeologist Adi Agus Octaviana applied a new dating technique called laser ablation uranium series imaging to a cave wall on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. On that wall, at a site called Ling Karampwang, there is a painted scene. Human-like figures interacting with a pig. A narrative image, not a single animal, not an isolated symbol, but a scene. Multiple figures. A story. When the new dating technique returned its result, the team read it twice. The painting was at least 51,200 years old. Humans have probably been telling stories for much longer than 51,200 years, Octaviana said. But as words do not fossilize, we can only go by indirect proxies like depictions of scenes in art. And the Sulawesi art is now the oldest such evidence by far that is known to archaeology. 51,000 years ago, on an island in Indonesia, a human being stood in a cave and painted a story. Not a symbol, not a handprint. A narrative characters, action, meaning. This was not someone at the beginning of thinking. This was someone at the height of it. So why did it take us this long to see it? Part of the answer is methodological. Dating techniques that can reach this far back with accuracy are new. The laser ablation method used in Sulawesi in 2024 simply did not exist 20 years ago. The evidence was always there. The tools to read it were not. But part of the answer is something else. Something less comfortable. For a long time, the story we told about the ancient past was a story of progress. A straight line from primitive to sophisticated, from darkness to light, from scratches and stone to the library at Alexandria. In that story, there had to be a beginning. A first moment of civilization. And we placed it in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago because that was the oldest writing we could read. Because it looked like us. What von Petzinger found does not look like us. The 32 signs are not words we can translate. They are not a language we can decode. They are marks that carry meaning we will probably never fully recover. But the fact that we cannot read them does not mean they were not writing. You cannot read the prescription a doctor wrote in 1840. That does not make it random scratches. The marks were made in firelight, deep underground, by people who had braved hundreds of meters of darkness to reach a surface they deemed worth marking. Some of the sites where the symbols appear required crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body, going so far underground that the entrance disappeared behind you. Whoever made these marks was not scribbling absent-mindedly. They meant something. They were placed. They were repeated. They were shared across generations and geography with extraordinary consistency. The symbols outnumber representational images in caves by at least 2 to 1. Geometric signs are not the footnote in Paleolithic art. They are the majority of it. We built the history of writing as a story that begins with civilization. But civilization did not invent writing. Writing was already old when the first city was built. The marks were already on the walls when the Sumerians pressed their first cuneiform wedge into clay. The vocabulary was already established, 32 signs, consistent across a continent, maintained across 30,000 years, before the concept of a king, a temple, or a state had entered human thought. The people who made those marks were not primitive. They were not at the beginning of something. They were running a shared visual communication system across thousands of miles with no infrastructure, no institution, no authority to enforce consistency. Only meaning, shared across time, scratched into stone, still there, waiting for someone who knew what to look for. If the story you were taught about where we came from just got a little more complicated, that is the point. Subscribe if that feeling is something you want more of, and leave a comment. If you could know what any one of the 32 symbols meant, what would you choose?